Your stalker is the only reason you aren't dead. He parked a black Mercedes outside your apartment for weeks. When you confront him, you find out he's not a creep, he's a crime boss, honoring a blood debt to your dead dad. 90 seconds later, a hit squad blows the doors off the room. To live, you have to follow the most dangerous man in the city straight into the underground. You and I are going to open this clinical case file together. We begin in the midnight silence, punctuated by the click of a loaded weapon. The subject here, Serena Vale, crosses the threshold, her elevated heart rate echoing among apex predators. She operates under the delusion that she controls her narrative, stepping blindly into Luca Varelli's territory. 12 enforcers sweat through their suits, yet Luca remains in a state of perfectly regulated physiological calm, a statue of breathless violence. There is a cold, behavioral lesson embedded in this pathology. Never enter a confined environment without first identifying who controls the exits. We are observing the early intuition of a vendetta, watered entirely by the unyielding arrogance of a megalomaniac narcissist. The environment froze the moment Luca delivered his terrifying promise. The first woman to walk through those doors, he murmured, belonged entirely to him. His subordinates experienced a spike in cortisol, refusing to breathe. Luca simply let a knowing smile alter his facial symmetry, orchestrating a psychological game while the others stared blankly. Then the heavy doors swung open. Serena stood bathed in the harsh light, wearing wrinkled hospital scrubs marked by a coffee stain, yet she commanded the space with absolute authority. Evaluate this behavioral truth carefully. True dominance never relies on outward presentation or tailored fabric. Real authority is built entirely on the unshakable, autonomic way a subject chooses to occupy their physical space. 12 armed enforcers instinctively reached for concealed steel, yet Serena exhibited zero startled response. We observe her fierce gaze lock directly onto the syndicate leader. Her voice sliced through the tension, clinically accusing him of stalking her and demanding answers about the dark sedan circling her residence. The baseline courage required to confront that room is a fascinating anomaly. While hardened killers suppressed their breathing, she remained rooted, propelled by sheer exhaustion and hyperarousal. This teaches a vital psychological lesson regarding our own trauma. Sometimes, marching directly into the epicenter of your greatest fear is the only mechanism to strip away its neurological control over you. The silence stretched, but she maintained total eye contact. Let us examine this visual, as we have all faced the edge of panic. There she stood, gripping a cheap taser, threatening the most lethal predator in the city. Luca finally stood, his towering silhouette casting a shadow of profound violence. His vocal tone remained a regulated rumble as he confessed his prolonged conviction on her. Serena fired back without hesitation, diagnosing it as a twisted obsession and pivoted to leave. She declared her involvement firmly terminated, but Luca sent his words chasing after her, cold and absolute. Their pathology had not even begun. This reflects a bitter clinical reality. A subject can attempt to outrun their deepest suppressed traumas, but eventually the psychological shadows will catch up and demand a final, devastating cognitive reckoning. The atmospheric pressure shifted dramatically as the true psychological nightmare took hold. Luca flawlessly recited a cryptic voicemail she received 2 weeks prior, a stimulus rationalized as a mere wrong number. The tremor in Serena's hands reveals her escalating panic response as she threatened to contact law enforcement. The megalomaniac narcissist simply observed her with a detached stare. He softly dismantled her reality, noting that the local authorities were on his payroll. Let this serve as an urgent diagnostic warning.
We must never ignore the strange behavioral anomalies in our daily routines. Those easily dismissed red flags are frequently the distant indicators of approaching systemic ruin.
Her defense mechanisms failed completely. She was entirely trapped. Just as he murmured that she was not his yet, the environment violently ruptured. The windows shattered under a ballistic assault as rival operatives rained fire into the space within sea. Within seconds, the meeting dissolved into sheer auditory chaos. Yet, defying basic self-preservation instincts, the ruthless megalomaniac threw his Azizmazivlesian directly over Serena. He became a living shield of tissue and bone, forcefully relocating her through the crossfire. This explosive moment illustrates a chilling psychological truth about human attachment. You never truly understand who is willing to bleed for you until your world is reduced to ash. In a fraction of a second, the very predator she feared had become the sole anchor to her continued survival. They bolted through the corridors, leaving the sounds of dying men behind them. Luca dragged her into an industrial panic room, sealing them inside a glowing tomb of monitors. Serena entered an acute of hyperventilation, her cognitive framework unraveling as she demanded an explanation. When Luca calmly stated her father's name, she defensively snapped that he had passed away 6 months prior. The dense psychological denial in that confined space is palpable. It highlights a devastating behavioral reality we must all internalize. Repressing a painful truth never successfully neutralizes it. It only ensures the trauma will completely destroy your mental architecture when it finally breaks through. Luca simply turned his broad back, ignoring the gunfire outside. Observe the exact moment a subject's reality permanently fractures. Luca established direct eye contact, systematically dismantling her foundational memories. He revealed her unremarkable father was a high-level money launderer for a violent syndicate. For 15 years, he concealed their financial pathology and, prior to his death, extracted their ultimate leverage. Her entire identity was constructed on a manufactured delusion. It is a haunting clinical realization. The primary caregivers we attach to the most are frequently the ones casting the most destructive psychological shadows. Serena suffered a gross motor collapse, processing that her gentle protector had washed millions in illicit blood money. The sudden decompensation of her innocence is a fascinating study in acute trauma. A rival apex predator named Dante has spent 6 months violently tearing the city apart for this missing ledger. Serena sits weeping, insisting her father left her nothing. Luca clinically dissects the trap. That ignored voicemail was a dead man's switch. When her father missed his check-in, the timer expired. Dante now assumes she controls his empire. Observe this brutal lesson. Willful ignorance provides zero biological shielding when you are placed inside a predator's enclosure. Psychopaths do not factor innocence into their behavioral equations. Curiously, the megalomaniac actually processes her tears as authentic data. His vocal register drops as he outlines Dante's profile. The rival will systematically dissect her, merely to hear her scream. Serena glares through her distress, questioning if Luca possesses a different pathology. He offers a hollow smile, readily admitting his own severe narcissistic traits make him far worse. Yet, his behavioral code dictates he honor his debts. Her father preserved his life, and Luca intends to reciprocate. He opens a panel, exposing a subterranean extraction route, allocating 90 seconds before the breach. Remain and be terminated, or form a trauma bond with a monster to survive. Life frequently forces the select between two devastating darknesses. Serena finally yields to her fundamental survival instinct. The cognitive dissonance crushing Serena's mind is immense.
Who struggle with crosswords secretly function within a high lethality environment.
That innocuous memory now registers as a terminal countdown. Note, Luca interrupts her spiraling decompensation, noting they have 60 seconds before structural failure. She analyzes his ski features a map of extreme antisocial behavior and issues a neurologically driven threat. If this is a manipulation, she vows to inflict severe trauma upon him. Never underestimate the kinetic energy of a shattered reality. A deep, righteous hostility can act as a stabilizing mechanism through the most severe psychological ruptures. The sociopath actually produces a low chuckle of genuine respect as they descend into the utter dark. Let us pause and analyze this behavioral trajectory. Particularly its rain down as an explosive breach neutralizes the barrier. Navigate the subterranean dark, the physical pressure mirroring their acute distress. Lou exhibits the lowered heart rate of a conditioned predator, while Serena battles the urge to undergo a total systemic shutdown. Panting, she demands their destination. The narcissist calculates that they are migrating to an undocumented level, purchasing a 6-hour window before the hunting party recalibrates. Note this fundamental heuristic of human survival. Time is the singular, non-renewable asset you can never psychologically recover. They breach a damp bunker, locating an untraceable gray sedan, the perfect apparatus for a pathological extraction. Let's open the file on these two. Shall we? You and I will see this pattern often. The vehicle tears out of the underground garage, hitting 60 miles an hour in seconds. Through the rearview mirror, Serena watches her only safe haven burn. In the driver's seat, Luca operates with the autonomic precision of a sociopath. When she screams that he has no soul, he violently wrenches the wheel, slamming her shoulder against the glass. It is a calculated behavioral correction. Panic in a crisis only digs your grave faster. That is a lesson you must remember when chaos hits. Keep your mind cold. In the suffocating silence that follows the physical trauma, the trauma bond begins to form. She whispers her first submission to him. She left his apartment untouched. Dashboard lights cast a clinical glow over Luca's features as he interrogates her. Were there observers at her building? They must vanish tonight. When Serena stammers about the crime scene, Luca clinically dissects her naive worldview. The syndicate owns the concrete. The police are bought. By dawn, the bodies will be smoke her. The psychological floor drops beneath her. Tears carve hot paths down her cheeks as cognitive dissonance sets in. She asks if her father was a good man. Luca refuses to administer the placebo of a lie. Her father was a highly dangerous individual, bathed in pathological violence. But there is a simple lesson here about human attachments. Love often requires stepping into the flames. He embraced his own destruction, just so his daughter would not burn. Luca grips the steering wheel, knuckles bone white, as the systemic pathology of her father is exposed. The man spent decades in constructing violent contingencies. Serena lashes out, cursing her father for destroying her future. Luca immediately establishes his dominance as her sole protector against Dardenti, a classic isolation tactic. They drive through ordinary neighborhoods under amber streetlights. The juxtaposition is clinically fascinating. A psychological war rages inside this vehicle while oblivious citizens walk their dogs. It teaches us a vital lesson. Never take the boring, quiet days for granted. because ordinary life can be permanently severed in an instant. They park near a decaying structure, find Tribrome's hiding her father's secrets. The tiny silver key she clutches is their only path forward. The unlit hallway reeks of damp earth and biological decay. Luca maneuvers with the detached precision of an apex predator. His pistol is raised instantly, and he orders her to stay behind him. Serena attempts a display of false bravado, a common defense mechanism, but Luca verbally dissects it. He reminds her she is entirely unequipped for this environment. There is a deeply practical lesson here for all of us. When you are thrust into a predatory environment you do not understand, surrender your ego immediately and let the veteran guide you. Luca bypasses the deadbolt in seconds. Inside, the apartment is a sterile time capsule of her father's antisocial isolation. The painfully mundane sagging couch and cheap paperbacks trigger a severe emotional response in her throat. Serena's fingers trace a faded photograph of herself on the dusty nightstand, triggering acute emotional distress. She questions if her father had already developed his sociopathic traits when that image was captured. Before the cognitive loop consumes her, Luca interrupts. Kneeling by a bookshelf, he examines a cheap paperback. He points to the copyright page. It was printed 3 months ago, but her father has been dead for 6. Occurred. Luca splits the spine, extracting a hidden flash drive. He immediately identifies it as a potential decoy. Here is a rule for surviving manipulative environments. The most obvious answer is usually a trap. Before she can process the paranoia, the psychological tension snaps. The wooden door explodes inward in a shower of brutal splinters. Serena bypasses the typical paralytic fear response. Her primal fight-or-flight mechanisms engages instantly. She dives behind the heavy sofa as automatic gunfire shreds the drywall. I have analyzed men like Luca for decades, and his reaction is textbook. His heart rate likely never spikes. He returns fire with terrifying, unemotional accuracy. 3 deafening cracks echo, followed by a heavy thud in the hallway. Luca commands a retreat, but this concrete trap only offers a rusted fire escape. Serena throws her entire body weight against the jammed window frame. It splinters open. The lesson here is profound. When trauma strips away every safety net you have ever known, the human organism will generate impossible strength to survive. The rusted iron groans as she scrambles into the dark alley. Let us open this clinical file together, you and I. Observe the physical response in our subject, Serena. As Luca sharply redirects her to the vehicle, her nervous system triggers violent tremors. Above them, mercenaries swarm her ruined apartment. The aggressor, Dante's Casimir, is acting as a classic megalomaniac narcissist, escalating into total warfare. Luca engages the transmission, tires screaming as they evaporate into the dark grid. He maintains a chilling focus on the mirrors, charting a path to remote location. Serena emits a fractured, hysterical laugh. Mere hours prior, her primary cognitive load was dinner selection. The lesson here is universally terrifying. The people who raise us are often strangers, concealing buried pathologies that eventually demand them in blood. Inside the moving vehicle, Luca initiates a fascinating psychological grounding technique. He quietly asks whether she chose pizza or noodles. Serena stares at his scarred profile, admitting she fell asleep on the couch. A microscopic spreads on his paralyzed facial muscles. He murmurs she should have selected the noodles. It is a surreal cognitive dissonance, yet a fractured smile breaks across her face. We see the fragile roots of Stockholm Syndrome forming as she seeks comfort in a highly violent man. As the city vanishes, the immense weight of her severed reality collapses onto her psyche, Destiny operates with pathological cruelty. The most violent shifts strike when our attention is elsewhere. 2 hours later, heavy grind to a halt at an isolated woodland structure. Observe the psychological weight of this cabin, where desperate elements go to erase their existence. Luca extinguishes the headlights, coasting into total darkness. Serena whispers the structure appears condemned. Luca clinically corrects her. Forgotten is simply safer. He steps into the mud, sweeping the tree line with his firearm. Every movement is a calculated algorithm. Serena realizes she is not witnessing fear, but the ingrained muscle memory of a man conditioned by perpetual threat. The lesson here is strictly unsentimental. Survival is never a statistical anomaly. Conditioned operators do not rely on hope. They survive through absolute paranoia and rigid behavioral programming. Once he signals the area is sterile, she steps out into the freezing air, immediately hit by the suffocating stench of wet rot. Let us unpack the psychological dynamics inside this freezing closure. Serena complains about the conditions, a defensive mechanism against shock. Luca explains that severing all tracking is the only way to evade a megalomaniac like Dante. He drops a microdrive onto the table. Serena demands a computer to access the data. Luca admits he has an encrypted terminal, yet his body language reveals profound hesitation. He delivers a clinical warning. If her father truly documented the syndicate, the unfiltered reality will cause catastrophic damage. This forces a critical life lesson to the surface. Sometimes, maintaining willful ignorance is the only defense mechanism that preserves our sanity. Unearthing buried truth often incinerates the memories of people we love the most. Serena simply clenches her jaw, bracing for the devastation. The observation deepens as Serena refuses to look away. As a medical professional, she routinely processes the physical wreckage of the human machine. She believes she can compartmentalize this trauma. Luca softly dismantles her hypothesis. He notes that emotional processing is radically altered when the perpetrator is your family. Serena emits a harsh, defensive laugh. Her entire childhood was a fabrication. This highlights a painful lesson. True cognitive recovery is impossible until the patient directly confronts the instrument of their mutilation. You must stare at the knife. Luca silently accepts her choice. He retrieves a battered laptop, connecting the drive. A staggering volume of illicit ledgers and encrypted data floods the monitor. The psychological detonation is ticking. Let us analyze this critical behavioral pivot together. The pale monitor projects skeletal shadows across Serena's face. Luca stands behind her, carrying the trauma of his own violent history. On the screen, her father's suppressed pathology is fully quantified. 15 years of systemic corruption and the coordinates of clandestine burials. It is enough leverage to dismantle Dante's empire. Driven by societal conditioning, Serena impulsively grabs her phone to contact law enforcement. Luca intercepts her trembling hand, emitting a hollow laugh. Listen to this vital lesson. Placing your faith in a corrupted authority structure is merely a secondary method of suicide. Before the legal apparatus could mobilize, a megalomaniac like Dante would simply incinerate the entire city to protect his fragile ego. Today, you and I are going to unpack this clinical case file together. Observe the subject, Luca. His vocal tone is a masterclass in psychological conditioning, absolute and devoid of warmth. He informs Serena that the megalomaniac narcissist they call Dante Vittorio will not simply kill them. He will butcher her entire social circle to establish dominance. Serena experiences severe cognitive dissonance as the laptop reveals the truth. Her father was not merely a passive accountant. The data shows international arms trafficking. Her father built the very infrastructure of a criminal empire. Here is a fundamental life lesson for our analysis. Morality offers zero physical protection against a sociopath. That small digital drive is their sole barrier against a total annihilation. Document her psychological collapse in this exact moment. Serena suffers an acute trauma response as she processes the visual stimuli. The photograph displays her father, but his microexpressions belong to a stranger. He stands among violent predators surrounded by illicit currency. Her mental barriers completely disintegrate. She staggers into the freezing night, exhibiting classic symptoms of a panic attack, gasping for oxygen. Luca follows a massive shadow of lethal compliance. When she questions his self-destructive loyalty, he offers only clinical silence. 5 years prior, her father intervened in Luca's inevitable demise. It is a brutal behavioral reality we must accept. You never truly comprehend the pathological secrets of your family until the consequences arrive. Luca finally articulates his underlying motivation, revealing a deep psychological anchor. He details how Serena's supposedly harmless father dismantled an explosive device meant for him. This act forged an unbreakable trauma bond, a debt Luca pays by ensuring her biological survival. Panic fully consumes her nervous system. She frantically proposes abandoning her identity, a common flight response. Luca dismantles this delusion with surgical precision. Dante is a malignant narcissist who controls the entire infrastructure, law enforcement, transit, and borders. You cannot evade a predator who owns the environment. The clinical lesson here is severe. Blind allegiance is a cognitive trap. It preserves your physical existence while systematically erasing your free will. Physical and mental exhaustion now overwhelm the subject. Serena's motor functions are failing as the ambient threat environment shatters her resilience. She begs Luca to cease his hypervigilance, yet he operates on pure survival conditioning and unresolved guilt. He exhibits a grim facial expression, stating his neurological systems will only rest when her safety is absolute. She collapses onto a filthy mattress, her sensory perception dulled by trauma. Before losing consciousness, she observes him guarding the perimeter, perfectly, a conditioned killer bathing in the moonlight. Her subconscious produces violent night terrors of her father's criminal pathology. The clinical takeaway is undeniable. Psychological tranquility is impossible when a targeted threat remains active. Observe the physiological state of the subjects at dawn. When questioned about sleep cycle, Luca emits an empty sound. He is fundamentally a behavioral machine engineered for conflict. Serena rises, her body aching from the stress hormones flooding her system. Luca immediately reverts to tactical calculation. The operational window is closing rapidly. When pressed for a strategic objective, he admits to cognitive uncertainty. They must transfer the drive to an uncorrupted authority figure, relying on public payphone to activate dormant assets. Let me share a crucial survival principle. Executing a flawed strategy always yields higher survival odds than passive paralysis in a hostile environment. They advance toward an abandoned fueling station. Note the physical toll on Luca's musculoskeletal system as he stretches in the oppressive silence. He guarantees a brief halt, casually noting that if Dante deploys his assets, they will systematically neutralize them. Serena trembles, recognizing that neutralization equates to extreme physical trauma. The environment presents a stark contrast, a serene dawn illuminating their potential execution site. Luca navigates the vehicle with mechanical precision, his firearm resting beside him. Serena fixates on the weapon, questioning her own capacity for lethal action, a classic escalation of survival's instinct. Here is a documented reality of human existence. The natural environment remains completely indifferent to your emotional devastation. The location is structure compromised, featuring an obsolete public telephone. Luca issues a direct command for her to remain concealed, but Serena's behavioral pattern shifts dramatically. She rejects the victim role, confronting the hostile elements alongside him. Luca deposits currency into the machine, executing a memorized dialing sequence. The respondent on the line exhibits extreme verbal panic. Dante's syndicate is systematically dismantling the urban grid to locate them. The criminal network falsely perceives this as a structural coup. Maintaining a suppressed heart rate, Luca demands the identities of an uncompromised federal operative. Record this essential psychiatric truth. Sometimes minor resource allocations can successfully delay an inevitable mortality event. You and I must analyze the suffocating pressure of this interaction. Luca extracts a name from an impossibly short list of uncompromised officials. The contact identifies Agent Sarah Chen, who has suffered extreme stress attempting to prosecute Dante, only to witness the systematic elimination of her assets. The geographical variable seals their predicament. Chen is isolated in a hotel located within the absolute center of the Haas territory. The contact terminates the connection in terracotta. Luca delivers the psychological blow. To utilize their leverage, they must re-enter the exact trauma zone they just fled. The clinical lesson is profound. Frequently, escaping a pathological cycle requires confronting the primary source of the trauma directly. Luca initiates the vehicle, stating the statistical impossibility of indefinite evasion. Serena processes this logic, and we observe her fear crystallizing into aggressive defense mechanisms. She fixates on the hardware, asserting they will not enter the kill zone without a tactical advantage. The father documented the compromised judicial and law enforcement assets. She proposes a mass data distribution to induce systemic panic. While Dante's operative teams manage the institutional fallout, they will infiltrate the urban center. Luca exhibits a microscopic expression of pride. Here is a definitive behavioral axiom. When facing a numerically superior predator, you must exploit their internal paranoia and weaponize their hidden pathologies against them. Concealed within the vehicle, Luca accesses the digital archives. His navigation uncovers layers of encrypted data, revealing a massive catalog of compromised institutional figures. Acknowledging the sophisticated pathology, Luca labels her father an apex architect of deception. Serena softly rationalizes her father's behavior as an obsessive compulsion for minor details. Luca rapidly constructs a psychological trigger, a blunt public broadcast designed to initiate maximum panic among the guilty parties. He cautions Serena that initiating this protocol will elevate their threat level to absolute priority. Her finger depresses the execution key. Note this psychological certainty. Nothing generates rapid behavioral destabilization, quite like exposing a narcissist's carefully constructed facade. Upon data dissemination, the city's corrupt infrastructure experiences acute systemic shock. Illicit networks overload as Dante's coordinated hunt devolves into a scramble for self-preservation. Securing the hardware, Serena questions their infiltration strategy. Luca rejects the behavior of typical prey. They will exploit the psychological phenomenon of inattentional blindness. As an it is a scatting for a distressed target, not an unremarkable domestic pairing. At a rural commerce point, Luca procures a subdued garment for Serena, the cheap material contrasting sharply with her internal trauma. Listen to this clinical fact. Extreme visibility often provides superior psychological camouflage compared to predictable concealment. Let us examine this behavioral shift together. Luca emerges, deliberately suppressing his predatory physical mechanics beneath unremarkable civilian attire. The lethal conditioning is entirely masked by a facade of mediocrity. Serena observes this transformation as Luca explains that true invisibility relies on failing to trigger a subject's threat detection. She retreats to a degrading facility to don the inexpensive garment. The reflection displays a traumatized survivor masking him as an ordinary citizen. They navigate directly into the congested traffic arteries, floating among burdened population who are completely blind to the innate predators hunting nearby. The most sophisticated defense mechanisms we deploy are the mundane identities we project to survive an utterly hostile environment. Let us open this case file together, you and I. We know how rapidly acute trauma strips away a subject's innocence. Yesterday, Serena presented as a weeping daughter. Today, her behavioral baseline mirrors a hardened survivor. They approach a derelict hotel where the syndicate buries its secrets. Luca parks blocks away. Observe his motor function. He reflexively checks his weapon, sliding the cold metal beneath his shirt. In the crowded lobby, Luca wraps his arm around her waist. To the untrained eye, they project a couple deeply in love, but Serena leans into him, driven by agonizing desperation. They climb the echoing stairs. The psychological lesson here is profound. Sometimes, fabricating a quiet smile is the only defense mechanism you have left to stay alive. Clinically speaking, the ambient stress is palpable as they pass the peeling numbers in this dim hallway. 410, 412. Luca wraps his scarred knuckles on the rotting wood, offering his identity and enough leverage to dismantle. The door, Pacho's door, cracks open, revealing Agent Chen with her weapon drawn and steady. She stares directly at the primary suspect of a mass casualty event. Yet Luca exhibits zero micro-expressions of fear. He simply offers the exact data required to dissect the kingpin. You can observe the desperate hunger warring with her professional skepticism. We must realize a crucial truth in our own lives. Facing the very stresses that threaten to destroy us is often the only psychological method to unlock the doors we assumed were permanently sealed. The acoustic void in that doorway is deafening. Luca lowers his vocal register, warning the agent that an extraction squad is closing in. If they bleed out here, the truth dies with them. Serena steps from the shadows, her hands displaying visible tremors, yet anchored by a tragic resolve. She confesses her father fed 15 years to the syndicate, archiving every violent act before they executed him. Every stolen life is encoded on one drive. Chen fights to maintain her stoic affect, but the pulse hammering in her throat betrays her autonomic arousal. She chased this phantom for 3 years. Life forces us all to these terrifying cognitive crossroads where we must accept the crushing risk, bypass our paralyzing anxiety, and simply leap into the unknown dark. Let us examine Chen's decision-making together. She bends her rigid protocols, granting a 5-minute window. They step into a claustrophobic shrine of pure obsession. Case files bury the floorboards, and a whiteboard screams the kingpin's name in red ink. The room reeks of chronic sleep deprivation. Luca hands over the drive. Chen opens the files, fighting to keep her expression neutral, but Serena catches the micro-expression in her jaw. Fabrication with the chilling ease of a seasoned sociopath. claiming her father left it as a failsafe. We see here that genuine psychological power is born from absolute patience. You must swap your paddy, your panic, holding your heaviest cards until the precise second to strike. The cold
Monitor illumination washes over Chen's dilated pupils. She realized this digital archive will incarcerate dozens of syndicate leaders, including the enforcer standing in her room.
She stares at Luca, processing the cognitive dissonance of a criminal willingly handing over his own execution orders. Luca displays zero flinch response. He turns his weary gaze to Serena, bartering his own survival to purchase her a future, a fascinating display of altered attachment. When Chen asks what Serena wants, she looks at their stained hands and whispers she just wants to survive long enough to remember who she is. True sacrifice is a brutal, agonizing psychological state. It means deliberately setting fire to your own world just to keep another person warm through the harsh winter. Adhering strictly to systemic rules during an act of exercise is a rapid catalyst for mortality. Luca's hand intercepting Chen before she taps the screen. The megalomaniac Dante controls his commanders. If initiates protocol, they will be neutralized before backup responds. Luca demands they vanish for 48 hours. Chen clings to institutional conditioning, but Luca shatters that cognitive distortion. He reminds her that blind protocol is exactly what puts her witnesses in body bags. He is handing her the architect of this misery, but she must spit him into the ethical mud to catch him. Sometimes you must discard the operational manual to manifest true justice. Chairs him down, slams her device shut, and promises to execute him herself if he attempts a betrayal. For a fragile second, their conflicting psychologies align. Then the door is violently kicked off its hinges. An assault team floods the room. Chen's autonomic nervous system takes over, dropping the lead aggressor with shoe shots. The environment erupts into absolute chaos. Luca forces Serena behind a mattress, returning fire as the suffocating stench of gunpowder fills the space. A second hitman falls, but heavy boots echo down the corridor. Chen screams to take the window. Serena throws the glass open, staring down 4 stories of lethal drop. When the flames are closing in, sometimes you must consciously override your basal survival instinct and leap into the unknown. They grab each other, hurling themselves into the terrifying, weightless dark. Let us process this visceral trauma together. Serena plummeted through the dark, slamming brutally into a canvas awning. The kinetic impact rips the fabric, dumping her onto a vehicle before she strikes the concrete. Her pain receptors scream, but her respiratory system still functions. Chen hits the alley next, dragging Serena toward an extraction vehicle. Luca crashes down last, hemorrhaging, but his focus blazes with lethal intent. Ballistic fire showers from above, pulverizing the pavement as they scramble inside. See the floors, the accelerator, tires screaming against the asphalt. A profound psychological lesson is forged here. When your world collapses into absolute ruin, you must cease the paralyzing loop of asking why, and simply drive forward into the unknown dark. They accelerate down the highway, transporting an archive of the syndicate's deepest pathologies. A narcissistic empire is hunting them. Chen navigates to a decaying farmhouse that exudes the scent of damp wood, providing a fragile shield. She initiates a data clone, ensuring the empirical truth remains intact. Luca asks for a timeline. Her response is clinically crushing 36 hours. While Luca paces, analyzing every mafia vulnerability, observes Serena. She absorbs her father's behavioral ledgers in the monitor's pale glow. The parental figure she idolized was actually a ruthless operative. Sometimes, The individuals we form our deepest attachments to hide the darkest demons. We must painfully accept that jarring cognitive dissonance if we ever hope to survive. Their physiological state deteriorates, sustained only by bitter caffeine. Systemic exhaustion settles into their neurology. Near midnight, Chen steps outside for a secure call, leaving Serena isolated with Luca. He suggests she initiate a sleep cycle, but a cynical defense mechanism rises within her. She emits a fractured laugh, stating that even if Kingpin is incarcerated, her hypervigilance will be permanent. Luca meets her gaze, offering a tragic behavioral truth. Eventually,
chronic fear simply integrates into your baseline neurology. Serena studies his physical trauma markers and the suppressed grief beneath them. She questions the root of his protective fixation.
The diagnostic truth is profound. Genuine loyalty is frequently anchored in deep, unhealed psychological pain. Luca enters verbal shutdown as wind batters the walls. Finally, his inhibition breaks. He reveals her father pleaded with him to isolate Serena from the syndicate's toxic influence. Luca makes eye contact, crumbling under acute moral injury. He feels he failed since she is now submerged in that exact nightmare. Serena's defensive posture softens. She notes that preserving her biological life still holds value. Consider this carefully. Sometimes altruistic intentions unravel into chaos, yet keeping loved ones breathing remains a profound victory. Abruptly, the quiet shadows of Chase burst inside her, drained of blood. She points to the monitor. A broadcast displays their previous hotel swarming with emergency vehicles, but the deceased subjects are not the primary threat. The monitor's glare washes over their fatigued expressions. You and I have analyzed the terminal desperation before the kind eliminating any psychological avenue for retreat. On the feed, the trio is captured, crossing the hotel threshold, cementing their public culpability. Chen Shen speaks, her voice strained. Megalomaniac cunt. Dante has dismantled her identity. The broadcast frames her as a fugitive, rendering her evidence inadmissible. Serena exhibits a freeze response, the psychological weight of their trauma suffocating her. Yet, when Chen elevates her chin, a terrifying sociopathic resolve forms in her pupils. Survival imparts a vicious lesson. When the environment strips away every secure harbor, the only adaptive mechanism left is to embrace the flames and let the old frameworks burn. Today, you and I are going to examine a fascinating psychological collapse. The air in the room thickens as Luca meets Chen's gaze, their silent pact cementing a boundary they can never uncross. We see Serena, a grieving nurse, holding a firearm with trembling hands, her vocal cords tightening as she asks how they plan to assassinate Dante. It is a profound clinical truth. The point of no return is not a physical location, but a permanent, dark, neurological rewiring forged in the human soul. Once that choice is made, it anchors itself until the grave. Chen brutally slams a war map onto the desk. Angry red circles designate violent fortresses, each state structure waiting in the dark, hungry to consume their shattered identities entirely. Chen identifies a warehouse on the map as the vital organ of Dante's operation. Strike here, she hypothesizes, and the kingpin abandons his throne. Luca neutralizes the thought immediately, warning that a direct assault guarantees body bags. Yet we observe a chilling clinical clarity wash over Chen. They do not require a physical slaughter. They merely need to engineer enough psychological agony to drag Dante into the light. Serena's nervous system triggers pure panic as she asks if premeditated murder is their objective. Chen replies with a razor-thin whisper. They only require a confession. The lesson here is an inescapable behavioral pattern. Unchecked arrogance is the exact mechanism a megalomaniac narcissist uses it to dig his own grave. Dante's pride will ultimately destroy him. Luca exhales a ragged breath, warning them that Dante is a paranoid ghost who ruthlessly erases loose ends. But Chen's vocal tone drops to a detached calm. They will surgically extract the single piece of humanity the narcissist actually cherishes. The room's atmosphere freezes as she slides a photograph across the table. Natalia, the sheltered daughter, kept and entirely blind to her father's bloody legacy. Luca stares at the image, his hands visibly trembling. Stealing crime lord child guarantees violent termination. Serena stands paralyzed, suffocating in the clinical madness of new reality. Desperation is a terrible master. When your back is pressed to the wall, raw survival terror always forces you to shatter the ethical boundaries you once swore to protect. Serena recoils, violently rejecting the idea of dragging an innocent into a trauma zone. Chen snaps back, displaying textbook emotional blunting. She argues that sharing Dante's blood makes the girl inherently guilty. Tears spill over Serena's lashes. If a father's sociopathy defines the child, she whispers, then she belongs in a maximum security cell too. The heavy words suffocate the room, and Chen's hardened facade briefly fractures. We know this tragic reality well. Survival rarely offers clean hands. It demands agonizing choices that permanently haunt the deepest corners of your brain. Luca sits frozen, admitting he damned his own psyche for much less. With no other rational escape, they commit to the most unforgivable behavioral strategy. They will deploy human bait. Serena sits in the dim light, her voice emotionally flat as she finalizes the trap. On the table rests Natalia's photograph. The girl offers a naive smile, blind to how her father's malignant narcissism will soon fracture her reality. Serena issues a desperate coping mandate. There will be no physical violence. She is a bargaining asset, nothing more. Luca and Chen nod, but behavioral plans born in the dark rarely remain sterile. They spend the night mapping the students' habits. Here is a vital psychological lesson. Routine creates a powerful neurological illusion of safety, but being predictable always makes you an easy target. By dawn, the trio rolls out in a stolen sedan, praying for a flawless abduction. In this violent underworld, a perfect crime is merely a statistical myth. Natalia emerges into the morning commute, earbuds sealing her off from the predators tracking her, reading Spien. Shinsity, she walks with course, the relaxed flow of someone untouched by severe trauma. The clinical reality is absolute. Ignorance never serves as a shield against the cruelty of life. In the car, Serena observes, her stomach twisting with stress-induced nausea. Luca asks if she wants to abort. Suppressing her guilt, she gives a stiff nod. They track the student into a coffee shop. Chen slips inside, waiting with reptilian patience. The millisecond Natalia looks away, Chen executes a calculated trip. Coffee spills, hands grab the target's arm, and verbal apologies follow. To the untrained eye, it appears to be a harmless accident. In truth, the psychological trap has permanently snapped shut. Observe the rapid deterioration of a morning's. Syringe is so small Serena barely registers the flash. Chen presses it into Natalia's arm, driving a potent depressant through her coat. The chemical binds instantly, the subject's eyes cloud over, and her motor control collapses. Chen screams for help, expertly mimicking the panic of a bystander. Luca swoops in, shouting as the car is idling. They hustle the flaccid body into the sedan before the crowd processes the abduction. Serena cradles the hostage as they arrive at a rotting lodge, swallowed by frozen woods. The lesson is grounded in clinical truth. Unforgivable deeds always demand a severely isolated environment to hide. They check her pulse. She is physically stable, but entirely trapped. Chen notes the subject will awaken without physical injury issues, but the cognitive dissonance of inflicting trauma actively erodes Serena's psyche. She envisions the narcissist Dante slaughtering innocence for his daughter. Luca slices through her panic with cold reality. He reminds her the kingpin constructed his empire through sociopathic choices. Here is a harsh clinical truth. You can never shield toxic individuals from the destructive fallout of their own behavior. Serena lacks the mental reserves to argue. She steps onto the freezing porch, trying to recognize the empathetic nurse she was 3 days ago. That innocent iteration of herself is already deceased. Luca steps into the cold, clinically analyzing her stability. Serena delivers a flat, devastating negative. Observe her closely. Serena's psychological framework is fracturing. She recalls her oath to never inflict harm, yet tonight she is an accomplice to abduction. Luca attempts to absorb the cognitive burden, insisting he and Chen committed the crime. Serena rejects the rationalization. Luca then offers a profound psychiatric truth. Pure terror is never a character defect. This is a vital clinical lesson. Fear is biological information, is pointing directly to the moral concepts you value most. Serena is terrified of developing the sociopathy that ruined her family, and that fear is the only pathway keeping her human. She asks what maintains his psychological vet integrity. His answer is totally hollow, nothing. He surrendered to his Stockholm syndrome long ago, praying only she escapes. Chen operates like a clinical psychopath, mounting a camera to force a behavioral shift. If Dante confesses, they return his child. Luca doubts the megalomaniac will fold. Chen reveals a brutal twist. She will threaten the subject's life on tape. Serena panics. Chen remains emotionally detached. They do not need to cause harm. They just need her father to process the credible threat. Here is a dark psychological lesson. The cognitive anticipation of violence is often more destructive than a physical act. Natalia groans, regaining consciousness. She squints against the lights, profoundly disoriented. When her eyes register the masked captors, sheer panic floods her nervous system. Serena steps forward, adopting the persona of a gentle savior to therapeutically lower the victim's heart rate. You and I are examining the clinical peak of this nightmare. Natalia's nervous system is overwhelmed. She shakes uncontrollably, begging for survival. Chen bluntly explains the subject is merely a bargaining chip. The hyperventilates, denying any knowledge of her father's syndicate. Luca delivers a crushing psychiatric truth. Her cognitive knowledge is irrelevant. It is her emotional value to the narcissist that makes her a weapon. Serena tries to provide comfort, but empathy registers as hollow manipulation coming from a captor. Chen ignores the trauma, forcing the weeping daughter to read the recorded demands. Here is a profound clinical lesson. No matter how untouchable a sociopathic monster appears, loving another human being will always remain their most fatal vulnerability. Step into this isolated environment with me. Natalia recites her coerced lines, trembling against the camera lens. Chen transmits the encrypted stimulus to the kingpin. Then begins the neurochemically depleting silence. Serena attempts to maintain her savior complex, but heroism is a hollow mask when you process the ransom. The phone vibrates. The Dante folds. Surrendering the coordinates, Chen is stunned, but Luca understands the fatal flaw of antisocial men. They hold the only sliver of humanity the narcissist has left. As the operatives spend the night preparing weapons, Serena stares at the ceiling in a dissociative state. The clinical truth settles incompletely. The agonizing cognitive anticipation of a traumatic event always shatters a human mind faster than the trauma itself. We observe Natalia slipping into a trauma-induced sleep. Serena monitors Chen, whose pacing mimics the erratic motor functions of a confined predator. Chen notes that the nervous system refuses rest before a major transgression. After years profiling violent offenders, crossing the legal boundary induces severe cognitive dissonance. Serena experiences a psychological fracture, questioning her own morality. She analyzes her deceased father, realizing his identity balanced on this exact ethical razor. Chen exhibits a flattened affect, warning Serena she is adopting his pathology. It is a fundamental law of behavioral conditioning. Expose a human mind to a malignant environment long enough, and the psyche will inevitably adapt to survive the dark. You and I know how daylight shifts the physiological profile of fear. The subjects prepare their firearms in a hyper-vigilant silence. Luca drives while Serena sits beside Natalia, who exhibits the vacant stare of profound dissociation. They arrive at an abandoned factory, the optimal arena for confrontation. Chen establishes a tactical vantage point above. Down in the dirt, Luca attempts to assert control. He insists he will handle the dialogue, demanding Serena flee if the negotiation degrades. She clings to him, projecting an irrational attachment. Luca offers a resigned smile, fully comprehending their grim reality. A clinical assessment reveals a harsh truth. Genuine survival always demands severing your deepest emotional tethers when the threat level inevitably peaks. Sedans secure the perimeter, neutralizing all escape routes. Dante Casimir enters the zone. While profiling anticipates a feral aggressor, Dante presents as an executive, projecting the autonomic control of an apex sociopath. Luca anchors himself, his stress manifesting as defiance. Dante exhibits a narcissistic smirk, mocking the youth for escalating to abduction. Luca demands the confession, but Dante merely requests his daughter. Serena pushes the weeping girl forward. For one micro-expression, Dante simulates the warmth of a devoted patriarch. Then his affective empathy evaporates. His focus turns glacial as he clinically informs Luca of his fatal miscalculation. The behavioral data is exceptionally clear. Never misdiagnose a composed psychopath as a subject devoid of lethal contingencies. Luca suppresses his panic, falsely assessing he holds the advantage. Stick with me, because we will now examine a severe psychological rupture. Dante manifests a sadistic grin, introducing a new variable. Enforcers extract a battered hostage, depositing him in the dust. Serena experiences immediate respiratory arrest. The subject elevates his head, displaying any acute remorse. It is Thomas Avilt, her biological father. Serena suffers a total collapse of motor function, gasping that she processed his funeral 6 months prior. Dante administers the Trozeby with surgical precision. It was a fabricated cadaver, entirely orchestrated by the father himself. This demonstrates a core psychiatric principle. A repressed reality is a persistent pathogen, always breaching the surface to infect the present. We monitor Serena as her cognitive schema shatters. She hyperventilates, unable to process the paradigm shift. Dante infantilizes her with clinical cruelty, deconstructing the elaborate deception. The cardiac event, the sealed casket, her prolonged depressive episode. It was all a theatrical mechanism. Thomas was scheduled to testify, but anxiety over his status triggered a cowardly flight response. Serena implores her father to negate the narrative, but Thomas remains paralyzed in mute submission. Dante relishes his dominance, confirming Thomas surrendered the data to secure his own immunity. Luca recognizes their operation was a determined failure. The pathology here is undeniable. Utilizing deceptive shortcuts consistently roots a subject directly into a psychological labyrinth. Dante extracts immense narcissistic supply from her suffering, detailing how he exploited her bereavement. Above them, Chen broadcasts a frantic alert, but Serena exhibits intense auditory exclusion. Her sensory input is locked entirely on her father. She verbalizes the trauma of mourning an empty vessel. Thomas attempts a desperate rationalization, claiming his fraudulent demise was a protective measure. We then witness a profound defense mechanism. Serena's effect completely flattens. She retreats, erecting an impenetrable emotional barricade. She diagnoses his motivation as pure self-preservation and permanently severs their familial bond. Dante laughs at the ruptured dynamic. The clinical deduction is absolute. Authentic attachment seeks to shield, whereas pure cowardice obliterates the dependent subject. Dante possesses the perimeter, flush with dopamine from the psychological devastation. He demands the authentic evidence, mocking their confusion. The acquired drive was merely a decoy containing a geolocator. The radio then emits Chen's heightened vocal stress. 24 operatives have surrounded the structure. Luca elevates his firearm, his adrenal response peaking as he demands the genuine files. At this juncture, Thomas volunteers a catastrophic confession. He personally destroyed all the archival data.
15 years of forensic evidence was incinerated to purchase his temporary security. This highlights a grim variable in behavioral psychology.
Guaranteeing one's biological continuity frequently requires permitting apex predators to operate entirely uninhibited.
The environment is saturated with terminal
inevitability.
You and I will analyze this escalation together. Dante bypasses his negotiation and discharges as a projectile into Luca's shoulder,
dropping him instantly. Displaying psychopathic detachment, Dante applies his weapon to Thomas Vale's cranium. The architect of the fake funeral faces actual biological cessation. Serena bypasses cognitive reasoning, operating on pure instinct. She acquires Sky sidearm and aligns the sights with Dante. We observe severe motor tremors in her extremities. She possesses no conditioning for lethal force, yet acute stress compels a behavioral override. This demonstrates a profound psychological metamorphosis. Extreme trauma systematically rewires a subject into the predatory entity they previously considered abhorrent. Dante evaluates Serena's firearm with a predatory smile. He weaponizes her cognitive dissonance, noting her father prioritized his comfort over her stability. Her compulsion to defend this parasite is highly pathological. The clinical data is clear. Unresolved attachment to a malignant family member but guarantees severe degradation. Dissing's zero autonomic arousal. Dante depresses his trigger. Thomas Vale undergoes immediate termination. Serena emits a vocalization of psychic rupture. Dante reorients, acquiring Serena as his target. Suddenly, a ballistic event interrupts the sequence. A projectile shatters Dante's arm. We observe Natalia, maintaining a steady stance with the discharged firearm. Her lifelong familial conditioning has fractured. The dependent subject has successfully terminated her traumatic enmeshment with the primary narcissist. Dante attempts to re-establish authority, but Natalia's dissociative barrier is impenetrable. She pulls the trigger, terminating the patriarch's biological functions. The perimeter descends into kinetic chaos. Clinical history confirms that systemic violence inevitably manifests to eliminate its architect. Weapon fire saturates the environment. Luca, managing acute trauma, orders immediate exfiltration. They propel themselves through the dust, dragging a catatonic Natalia. Chen provides suppressive force from above. They breach the exterior, but the vehicle is distant. A ballistic round impacts Chen's leg, neutralizing her mobility. Luca attempts an extraction, but Chen forcefully negates his intervention. The behavioral calculus is brutal. He must process the agonizing cognitive load of abandoning a vital pack member to secure the survival of the remaining unit. Hemorrhaging in the dirt, Chen orders Luca to sever his attachment. This demonstrates a deviation from the self-preservation instinct. Genuine loyalty supersedes individual survival. Chen establishes a defensive posture. Luca compartmentalizes his trauma, dragging the subjects to the vehicle. 3 kinetic discharges echo, followed by silence. The operative is deceased. Luca operates the wheel with one arm, his blood contaminating the surface. Behind him, Natalia exhibits hysterical vocalizations, processing the execution of her father. Let us examine what happens next, because this descent is far from over. Luca's phone initiates a haptic response. An artificially synthesized voice. This asserts they possess syndicate assets. Luca, operating on adrenal exhaustion, informs the entity that the evidence is already reduced to carbon. Examine this clinical file with me. We might assume the trauma phase has passed, but pathology holds one final variable. The voice on the phone presents a calculated ultimatum. The primary data is ash, yet the megalomaniac narcissist Vittorio knows a backup exists. He offers Serena a choice: surrender the drive or face total erasure. Demonstrates a simple life lesson. Avoidance mechanisms fail because our past sins always leave an indelible footprint. Serena recognizes the pursuit is merely beginning. They drag their physical forms to a deteriorating swamp structure. Luca navigates the vehicle through severe blood loss, manifesting textbook Stockholm syndrome by using the ruined silk of his former captor's daughter to bind his own wounds.
Inside the decaying structure, the wind simulates an auditory hallucination. Natalia remains entirely catatonic, with only the appendages she used to terminate her own father.
Under the low-spectrum light, Serena applies pressure to Luca's severe avulsion. She pleads for medical intervention, but his survival instincts override logic. A hospital would register their coordinates to predators. Here we observe a simple life lesson. Authentic resilience requires elevating the safety of your chosen unit far beyond your own physical suffering. He prefers exsanguination over jeopardizing her survival. Serena constricts the bandage, tracking his involuntary muscle contractions. Did her father truly incinerate the variables? Luca provides only a clinical, profound silence. You and I must analyze this collapse piece by piece. Luca dismantles their cognitive dissonance. The syndicate operates on the fixed belief that a backup drive remains. Physiological dread activates within Serena's amygdala. Her father functioned with methodical paranoia, but where is the contingency? Luca notes the subject was too preoccupied orchestrating his own violent cessation to leave a map. This isolates a simple life lesson. Constructing elaborate walls of secrecy to shield your attachments merely paints a massive target on their backs. Natalia finally breaks her mutism. She reports that, prior to the ballistic exchange, Serena's father delivered a pathological confession. Serena was the singular, uncorrupted variable he ever engineered. Natalia details how her biological creator manipulated her as a disposable asset. Serena processes the weight of that malignant childhood. Natalia exhibits emotion dysregulation, recalling the eye contact maintained before initiating the fatal ballistic trauma. In this sociopathic environment, morality is an illusion. We note a simple life lessons. Shared traumatic stimuli consistently forge an iron psychological bond far faster than positive reinforcement ever could. The environment flatlines as Lua succumbs to hemorrhagic shock, but the isolation shatters. Raina's cellular device vibrates violently. A synthesized vocal tone queries a behavioral choice, dispensing a chilling laugh. The megalomaniac narcissist has geolocated them. Serena experiences severe vasoconstriction. The patriarch communicates with an abnormal deceleration of heart rate. He allumates 3 minutes before his operatives dismantles the structure, demanding the digital collateral. Luca. Heir's sympathetic nervous system triggers, adrenaline overriding his febrile state. He establishes visual contact with Natalia, and her depressive episode converts into a primal survival response. They secure city offensive, fracturing the rear exit and submerging into the freezing marsh. High-intensity photons penetrate the atmospheric density. We derive a simple life lesson here. When apex predators are actively tracking your scent, you cannot waste cognitive bandwidth mourning the psychological baseline you just lost. You must initiate forward momentum if you intend to outlive the nocturnal cycle. Luca propels through the contaminated aquatic environment, his compromised vascular system expelling fluids. Ballistic reports fracture the acoustic baseline. As illumination sweeps the vegetation, they forcibly submerge. Emerging from oxygen deprivation, they drag their depleted musculature onto solid terrain. Luca verbalizes the necessity of a vehicular asset. Serena counters with the need for a strategic framework. Luca simply welcomes her into his dysregulated pathology. They intercept a civilian vehicle. When the anxious operator reaches for a device, Luca instantly brandishes his firearm. This exposes a simple life lesson. Severe physiological desperation will inevitably compel a subject to violate ethical boundaries they as previously considered absolute, strictly to maintain biological continuity. Let us observe this structural pivot together. Luca acquires the transport, and Serena assumes operational control while he regresses into a pain-induced dissociative state. Natalia occupies a catatonic void, her progenitor's biological residues still coating her epidermis. She queries their coordinates. Serena lacks a data point until her device activates. It is Agent Chen. The operative survived the structural collapse, dragging her traumatized extremity through the Chen discloses that the definitive variables are encrypted under Project Lighthouse. We extract a simple life lesson here. Authentic psychological allegiance is never during periods of stability. It is solely verified when the subject is systematically dismantled, yet refuses to terminate the mission. Chen instructs the subject to perform a cognitive retrieval. Serena's hippocampus initially yields 0 data until a repressed schema activates. She visualizes her father at an isolated maritime structure, aggressively conditioning her to retain the coordinates. Mariner's Point. Chen confirms the data is interred there, but warns of an elite determination squad. Serena exhibits adaptive paranoia, questioning Chen's potential allegiance to the syndicate. The operative S response is clinically devoid of reassurance. You cannot achieve certainty. This dictates a simple life lesson. The human condition rarely provides neurological comfort of absolute verifiable trust. You must frequently suppress your amygdala response, accept the chaotic variables, and execute a leap into the unknown. Serena articulates the high-risk behavioral paradigm. Luca, experiencing severe hypothermia, deduces a high probability of a systemic failure. He resents exsanguinating from manipulative phantom. But Serena's prefrontal cortex overrides the panic. She refuses to grant the environment a victory. Observing her stabilization, Luca's trauma bond activates. They deviate to a clandestine facility operated by Dr. Rosa. The practitioner analyzes the trauma and abstains from all inquiries. She mechanically sutures the tissue and dispenses pharmacology. We catalogue a vital, simple life lesson here. At maximum psychological degradation, a subject does not require an audit of their maladaptive choices. They merely require immediate physical stabilization to sustain the fight. Serena subjects her reflection to visual analysis, exhibiting severe depersonalization. 72 hours is all it took to dismantle her psychological architecture. She observes Dr. Rosa dressing Natalia S. severe dermal abrasions. Rosa S. clinical gaze identifies the physiological markers of impending mortality. Luca transparently classifies their threat level as terminal. Demonstrating zero moral judgment, Rosa provides sterile garments and physical currency. Serena hesitates, but Rosa interjects, citing her familiarity with the rigid behavioral loops of a vendetta. This offers a functional, simple life lesson. A subject must never allow ego-driven pride to obstruct external stabilization. When an anomaly provides a genuine survival mechanism during peak crisis, the optimal response is wordless acquisition. Reintegrating into the night, they process Rosie S. final clinical directive to ensure the objective validates the biological expenditure. They maintain momentum for hours. Natalia achieves unconsciousness, while Luca battles the pharmacological sedatives. Serena exhibits hypervigilance and scanning for predatory pursuit. Eventually, dawn illuminates the decaying infrastructure of Mariner Point. Balancing on the precipice, the abandoned structure stands dormant. They breach the perimeter, and Luca initiates a kinetic strike, fracturing the entryway. This leaves us with a simple life lesson. The empirical data required to stabilize a crisis is often entombed within the most aversive, degraded environments imaginable. You simply require the audacity to violently breach the threshold. Let us examine the final diagnosis. The atmosphere is saturated with the residue of maladaptive choices. Serena navigates the ascent. At the apex, a metallic enclosure awaits. Her motor functions exhibit tremors as she compromises the mechanism. The contents reveal a digital device, a photograph, and a manuscript from her paternal figure. It functions as a terminal confession. He admits constructing her cognitive reality upon pathological deception. The drive contains variables to dismantle the megalomaniac narcissist S empire. He engaged in bilateral manipulation, paralyzed by the terror of her loss. We conclude with a tragic, simple life lesson. Biological fear initiates erratic behavior, but deploying deceit to insulate your attachments mathematically also ensured they end up directly in the fatal trajectory. You and I are going to unpack this clinical pathology together frame by frame. Foreign citizen Serena is processing the android into a confession. Psychologically, the father's ink registers not as text, but as an acute traumatic stress. Beside her, Luca inserts the encrypt the ink drive. Operating with the detached compliance I often see in trauma victims, the monitor illuminates a systemic web of corrupted authority. Natalia leans closer, her respiration halting as the screen exposes her own father's name. The psychological assessment here is inescapable. Repressed secrets act exactly like dark, rising water. No matter how deeply a narcissist buries their transgressions, the behavioral tide inevitably turns, drowning everyone who aided in the suppression. Notice the hyperventilation.
Serena experiencing a kinetic panic response, her respiratory rate spiking as the classic drive registers as both survival and execution.
The environmental baseline shatters when Luca's phone vibrates. A synthesized voice bleeds from the trigger, triggering an immediate fight or flight sequence. Serena rushes to the glass. Through the coastal fog, 3 black vehicles slowly circle the perimeter like predatory subjects analyzing an enclosure. Armed men step into the mist. Surrender the drive or die, the voice dictates. Serena attempts a desperate cognitive negotiation, asking how they can trust an antisocial personality. The clinical lesson is stark. When malignant predators actively breaching your perimeter, attempting rational negotiation is simply a psychological mechanism that guarantees you lose absolutely everything. Confined at the geographic edge, the subjects face a physical dead end above crashing waves. The antagonist's a strict 5-minute psychological deadline. Luca exhibits severe psychomotor agitation, pacing erratically, while Serena channels her cortisol spike into targeted action. Her father deliberately selected a lighthouse for its high visibility stimulus. Her trembling fingers secure the rusted grip of a flare gun, firing a brilliant crimson streak into the atmospheric fog. Luca questions this primitive defense mechanism against an armed unit. Serena operates on sheer cognitive desperation, hoping Agent Chen observes the signal. The psychiatric lesson is profound. When trauma backs you to the absolute edge, with 0 variables left to control, throwing a blind prayer into the void is the most resilient cognitive act the human mind can generate. The temporal window closes. Serena discharges the final flares as the perimeter defenses are violently breached. The rhythmic auditory stress of combat boots ascends the staircase. Luca elevates his weapon, his tremors indicating acute nervous system overload, pleading for Serena to conceal herself. Instead, she anchors her posture beside him, displaying a complete acceptance of the terminal outcome. The primary aggressor breaches the threshold. Suddenly, high decibel sirens disrupt the environment. The mercenaries exhibit immediate paralytic shock. Outside, federal cruisers flood the visual field with red and blue lights. Agent Chen steps into the headlights, shifting the power dynamic entirely. The clinical lesson here is clear. True psychological loyalty is refusing to let a bonded partner face execution in isolation, maintaining solidarity no matter how terminal the prognosis appears. The hostile operatives rapidly calculate their survival matrix, choosing to discard their firearms. The sound of steel striking floorboards triggers an immediate sympathetic response in Serena. Her knees buckle as the systemic adrenaline aggressively metabolizes, leaving her sliding down the masonry. Agent Chen ascends the structure, utilizing dark humor as a decompression tactic. Luca is visibly stunned by the federal mobilization. Chen rationalizes the response, noting that offering institution a high-value target guarantees maximum force. Serena surrenders the encrypted data. Chen processes the files, her facial microexpressions shifting at the documented pathology. The behavioral lesson is absolute. Unchecked narcissistic greed constructs massive structures of control, yet a single, undeniable data point of truth is to completely dismantle that systemic illusion. Let us look at the progression piece by piece, shall we? Agent Chen suggests this data might offset her father's antisocial history. Serena remains non-responsive. The familial betrayal trauma is too acute for rationalization. Outside, tactical units secure the hostile operatives. Chen outlines an isolated future of witness relocation and chronic hypervigilance. However, Serena fixates on the root cause, demanding the identity of the megalomaniacal narcissist orchestrating the violence assigned. The later, within a sterile interrogation suite, Serena finally verbalizes her repressed history. The vocalization process is visibly nauseating for her. Listen closely, as the clinical lesson here is vital. Avoidance behavior only reinforces a trauma loop. Forcing yourself to clinically examine your darkest psychological wounds is the mandatory first step toward stabilizing your mental baseline forever. Serena is placed in a secure, sensory-deprived hotel environment. She exhibits classic dissociative behavior under a scalding shower, observing the physical evidence of trauma wash away. Systemic exhaustion forces her into a deep sleep cycle, where her subconscious projects an idealized manifestation of her father. Emerging from sleep, she experiences acute cognitive dissonance, realizing the paternal figure was a calculated deception. We must acknowledge this psychological lesson. Discovering that your foundational developmental memories were manufactured by a manipulator triggers a grief that shatters your core identity. An abrupt knock breaks the isolation. Chen enters, illuminated by a monitor's pale glow. The systemic collapse has begun. Chen reveals the visual data, finally applying a human profile to the megalomaniac who ordered their termination. The monitor displays Victoria Strand. Clinically, Strand operates as an apex megalomaniacal narcissist, manipulating the underground without leaving a behavioral footprint. Suddenly, Chen's device vibrates, and the agent exhibits a rapid loss of facial pigmentation. The stimulus is a photograph. Luca is depicted unconscious, restrained to a steel chair. The accompanying text establishes a 12-hour hostage parameter. Serena experiences a sudden respiratory paralysis. Chen hollowly admits they have an embedded hostile agent within their hierarchy. The operational lesson is grimly accurate. The most devastating psychological betrayal is rarely executed by a known antagonist, but by the trusted confidant within your inner circle. A radical emotional blunting washes over Serena. The flight response is entirely extinguished. Driven by her profound trauma bond, she prepares to retrieve him, regardless of the mortality risk. Stick with me here, because this is where her psychological baseline fundamentally shifts. Serena maintains direct eye contact, entirely shedding her victim persona. Affective flattening replaces her terror. She dictates an analytical approach to their 12-hour deadline. Bypassing the compromised institution, Chen isolates a splinter cell of uncorrupted assets. They conduct a forensic audit of Strand's accounts, locating an anomaly, an abandoned industrial site fortified with high-grade surveillance. Chen clinically assesses the location as a fatal entrapment scenario. Yet, Serena equips a ballistic vest, exhibiting a fractured, detached smile. "Let the narcissist wait," she whispers. The cognitive lesson is counterintuitive but true. Sometimes the only method neutralize a pathological manipulator is to willingly step directly into their meticulously designed trap and dare the beast to bite. The tactical unit instructs Serena to maintain distance during this breach. She provides a nod, displaying textbook deceptive compliance. As daylight hits the grid, the doors are explosively compromised. Operators flood the interior, their tactical lights cutting the darkness. The auditory chaos rapidly decays into a sterile silence. The environment is completely void of biological targets. No mercenaries, no megalomaniacally, merely a solitary chair supporting an active laptop. Chen approaches the device, experiencing acute physiological dread. It is a synchronous video feed. Lucas sits bound and hemorrhaging. Victoria Strand stands casually behind him, pressing the barrel of a pistol directly to his cranium. The clinical lesson remains harsh. You can dedicate your cognitive capacity to outmaneuvering a sociopath, but their dark pathology always maintains another manipulative variable in reserve. Serena breaches the perimeter, stating into the mic that Strand's execution protocol is inevitable. Through the transmission, the megalomaniac projects a sociopathically polite smile, proposing a sadistic behavioral contract. Also, face a prolonged torture protocol. It is pure calculated cruelty. Despite the firearm against his skull, Luca exhibits the ultimate manifestation of his trauma bond. He looks into the lens and executes a single negative head shake, actively choosing termination over surrender. Victoria initiates a 30-second psychological countdown. Chen steps back, transferring the moral weight to Serena. The temporal limit decays. Went. Fifth. The clinical lesson is profound. Authentic loyalty is not merely physical proximity. It is the conscious willingness to absorb a bonded partner's agonizing as an extension of your own mind. 10 seconds remain on the pathological countdown. Serena retrieves the drive, exposing it to the optical sensor. 5 seconds. Displaying remarkable emotional regulation. Her vocal pitch remains flat as she demands coordinates. At the 2-second mark, Victoria's narcissistic smirk expands, dictating a rendezvous at the Eastern Pier in yen minutes. Isolation is mandatory, or the hostage is eliminated. The transmission terminates. Chen's has been intervention, begging her not to enter a statistically fatal environment. But the traumatized persona is permanently excised. Serena breaks the contact. Operating in a state of hyper-rational clarity, she calmly requests a plastic training decoy from the tactical unit. She is restructuring the psychological power dynamic. The behavioral lesson is paramount. When a sociopathic entity invites you into a rigged matrix, you never engage under their parameters. You systematically rewrite the board entirely. Let us open this file and examine the subject. Serena, she stands amid the relish of Pier, demanding Agent Chen thread a recording device straight through her Kevlar vest. She wants Victoria, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, to confess her sins on tape. Serena carries the final nails for her father Vittorio's coffin. When she steps into the thick mist, Victoria materializes like a phantom, armed and radiating pathological arrogance. Beside her is Luca, beaten nearly to death, his physical state masking deep, untreated trauma. Serena presents the decoy drive to the pale moonlight. You and I are going to unpack this case together because it teaches us a crucial lesson. Courage is completely useless until you finally endure the psychological adrenaline of drawing the blade. The physical evidence clatters across the concrete. Victoria snatches the decoy drive, her reward centers lighting up with a false sense of victory. When Serena demands Luca be released, Victoria counters with a predictable threat of systemic violence. Clinically, Victoria is entirely detached from reality. Even as Serena calmly outlines the impending federal raid, the boss remains encased in her own delusion, convinced her wealth will insulate her from consequence. Victoria raises her weapon, categorizing Serena as a mere operational liability. Serena simply closes her eyes, accepting the outcome. We see this severe cognitive distortion often in high-security wards. Extreme arrogance acts as a heavy blindfold, preventing the subject from seeing the cliff edge until gravity takes over. The trauma of a gunshot violently resets the scene. Serena anticipates the termination of her life, but experiences zero pain receptors firing. Opening her eyes, the visual data is staggering. Victoria suffers a catastrophic chest wound, her delusion collapsing as she drops dead on the concrete. The shooter is Natalia, a traumatized orphan operating under acute stress. Gripping the pistol, you wish she rationalizes her behavior, whispering she simply neutralized another monster. Serena sprints forward to release Luca as police sirens flood the area. Through extensive facial contusions, Luca offers a smile. The Stockholm Syndrome bonding them has mutated into a profound attachment. Quiet individuals often harbor the most terrifying resilience when their entire environment shatters. The weapon slips from Natalia's fingers, the drop in adrenaline triggering an immediate psychological collapse. She demands to know the final body count required to end her trauma loop. Agent Chen approaches, breaking strict procedural protocol. She envelops the trembling girl in a physical embrace, offering necessary nervous system regulation. As the sun illuminates the yellow perimeter tape, Serena processes the destruction of former baseline reality. Chen confirms the legal eradication of the Trishitov syndicate is underway. Serena analyzes Luca and Natalia, recognizing 3 fractured psyches tethered by shared violence. She softly commits to their collective rehabilitation. You cannot undo the catastrophic arson of your past, but you retain full autonomy over who sits with you in the ashes. We move forward in the patient timeline. The environment shifts to a sterile federal facility, saturated with the smell of industrial cleaner. Serena sits isolated behind bulletproof glass, staring at files of her father Vittorio's megalomalignant empire. His megalomaniac narcissism is categorized into boxes meant to dismantle his accomplices. Following prolonged interrogations, Agent Chen enters. She walks with a limp, a physical marker of the incident, yet projects dominant posture. She delivers the empirical data. 47 federal indictments are active. The pathological network is in terminal decline. The absolute truth operates with a ruthless gravity. No amount of psychological repression or buried dirt can stop it from eventually breaking right through the surface. A manic energy permeates the corridors, but Serena exhibits a flattened affect, gripping a paper cup merely for thermal feedback. When Chen suggests Vittorio would be proud, the tension spikes. Serena Essie gaze narrows into cold hostility. She clinically dissects her father, a megalomaniac narcissist who fabricated his mortality for 6 months, deploying psychological manipulation under the delusion of protection. Serena establishes an impenetrable boundary, terminating her pursuit of his approval. Transitioning from caregiver to an architect of ruin requires killing the internal idol. You must never allow a corrupted family dynamic to overwrite your identity. Sometimes, psychological survivor demands you pick up the blade and cleanly amputate the rotting limb yourself. Serena Essie cognitive rewiring is a fascinating study in trauma adaptation. She crossed the threshold from medical preserver to systemic destroyer. Chen offers standard witness protection and a sanitized identity. It is the path of least psychological resistance, yet Serena rejects the stimulus entirely, refusing to fracture her ego into a secondary persona. In an adjacent cell, Luca endures his own clinical evaluation. The behavioral unit is paralyzed, unable to classify him as a victim of Stockholm Syndrome or a sociopathic aggressor. He is the volatile catalyst that ignited this inferno. Running from your history is merely a temporary cognitive distortion. True structural integrity requires standing in the blast radius of your past and claiming your actual name. Total immunity is the ultimate behavioral reinforcer. A fatigued prosecutor presents Luca with exactly that. Surrender the data, walk away clean. But Luca ignores the expected reward. He locks visual focus and firmly negates the offer. His baseline remains chillingly stable as he maps his history. He acknowledges his role as a weapon, heavily influenced by his profound Stockholm Syndrome. He agrees to expose every grave, but insists on remaining locked inside a maximum security enclosure. He is actively prescribing his own punishment. A fractured psyche cannot be repaired with legal loopholes. True rehabilitation only begins when a subject willingly absorbs the crushing weight of their own terrible actions to purchase back a fraction of their ruined humanity. Let us examine the mechanisms of guilt together. Luca informs the authorities his Zoid's behaviors have ceased, calculating that incarceration is the only math balancing his ledger. Meanwhile, we observe Natalia at her father's burial site. The megalomaniac narcissist purchased terror, yielding only a cheap granite marker. Operating under severe cognitive dissonance, she verbally processes the execution of Victoria. She is trapped between two conflicting self-assessments. Is she a protector or a newly activated psychopath? Human behavioral patterns are excruciatingly messy. Often, the psychological response to saving a life is identical to the trauma of taking one. We must accept the gray areas, because absolute, pure morality is a comfortable fiction. The tactile sensation of the granite offers zero dopamine regulation. Natalia lowers her center of gravity, grounding herself as she traces the lettering. She officially terminates her status as his compliant asset. Her developmental years were hijacked by his pathological control, but her current state demands autonomy. She pledges to dismantle his illicit infrastructure, planning to expose every compromised official. Agonizing psychological contradiction surfaces before she leaves. Her voice strains as she admits a deep traumatic affection for her abuser, followed by immediate self-revulsion. The human psyche is a terrifying paradox. Extricating yourself from a toxic bloodline mirrors the physical trauma of a brutal organ removal, but it is the only procedure for survival. The judicial theater begins on a Monday. Media personnel flood the room, craving the spectacle of ruin. Serena takes the witness stand on day 4. Her presentation is muted, a plain flute suitie acting as psychological camouflage. She initiates a systematic data dump. With a clinically flat effect, she catalogues the extreme anomalies of Vittorio, the megalomaniac narcissist, and the mechanics of his operation. Defense attorney employs aggressive verbal stimuli, attempting to reframe her as a financially motivated sociopath. Serena's autonomic nervous system simply does not react. She maintains locked eye contact, weaponizing the objective truth. When a subject fully assimilates their severe trauma and abandons their secrets, external character assassinations completely loses its penetrative power. Serena's testimony is a fascinating study in cognitive recalibration. She admits past willful blindness, yet her vocal cadence hardens to steel when rejecting that blood money. The psychological weight lifting off her is palpable. Then we observe Luca. Entering the sterile courtroom, he exhibits the hypervigilance of a judged predator. He corroborates her timeline perfectly. When the defense attempts to discredit him, Luca displays a calculated smirk, advising the breathless gallery to ignore his word and simply trust the forensic paper trail. Finally, Natalia takes the stand. The daughter of Vittorio, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist, drops the hammer, detailing his midnight extortions. We cannot rewrite our genetic trauma, but this proves we possess the neurological agency to shatter toxic bloodlines.
Let us step into that quiet courtroom together. The fluorescent lights hum, casting bruised shadows across the heavy mahogany. You and I know these psychological traumas never resolve cleanly.
Natasha takes us the stand, her motor functions compromised by tremors as her childhood illusions disintegrate. Her affect is entirely flat, mourning the father who tucked her in while simultaneously authorizing executions. It is a severe cognitive dissonance. 6 weeks later, the gavel strikes. 43 syndicate members are incarcerated. Serena watches the late broadcasts alone in the dark, presenting with complete emotional blunting. She feels More's absolutely nothing. Here is the clinical reality. The judicial system is a necessary structural framework, but it will never repair a fractured psyche. That cognitive reconstruction is an agonizing, solitary protocol you must execute alone. The breaking news flashes a harsh spectrum of light across the monitor, but it fails to alter the psychological vacuum of Serena's apartment. It does not neutralize her father's fabrications or stabilize her dissociated state. 3 agonizing days blur into a dissociative fugue before Chen arrives, his posture signaling severe environmental stress. Luca faces the magistrate tomorrow, looking at 5 years in a maximum security unit because he actively rejected full immunity. Serena dismisses this as a pathological, noble, and suicide mission. The pale morning light finds them in a stifling courtroom, observing a hardened judge immune to manipulative behaviors. True behavioral accountability always demands a pound of flesh. Yet, clinically speaking, paying that agonizing debt is often the only mechanism to deactivate the brain's threat response and finally achieve restorative sleep. The presiding judge stares directly through Luca, her vocal cadence echoing as she clinically outlines his history of violence. She dissects his role in maintaining a pathological organization. Luca merely stands there, exhibiting rigid muscle tension in his jaw. She notes his refusal of immunity, offering a rare micro-expression of a respect for a subject willing to accept his consequences. The gavel drops on a 3-year sentence. As the iron des gaze retract, his pupils lock onto Serena. One steady nod is exchanged. It is a profound manifestation of Stockholm Syndrome, a nonverbal transmission of complex loyalty forged in the fire's survival. Later, Serena frozen in her father's dark, empty residence. You can evade the psychological specters of your past using avoidance tactics for years, but eventually you must confront the source of the trauma and permanently seal the door. Serena drifts through the environment like an apparition, treating her childhood habitat as an active psychological crime scene. Deep inside a dark closet, 30. First fade is fortune Winsmith's the displaying positive offered beneath the envelope designated for her 18th birthday. It is a posthumous behavioral admission. She tears it open, experiencing acute physical tremors. His hurried script reveals a devastating cognitive dissonance. He desired to confess his violent antisocial behaviors, but was paralyzed by anticipating her trauma response. He opted for concealment. Let us look at this tragic reality together. Shielding your primary attachments with systematic deceit is a slow-acting neurotoxin. Genuine devotion requires the psychological resilience to articulate the objective truth, regardless of the emotional cost. The letter fades into a contradictory rationalization, offering remorse for the gaslighting while rigidly defending his protective measures. As Serena traces the erratic handwriting, the clinical paradox crystallizes. The apex predator of the criminal underworld was simultaneously a highly anxious parental figure, pallied by his own attachment. The human brain is agonizingly compartmentalized like that. As the sky shifts to a bruised purple, she abandons the keys and drives to the cemetery. She grounds her body against the damp soil beside his granite marker. Staring into the earth, she vocalizes into the twice that she refuses to grant him psychological absolution. Listen. You and I both know she does not shut up.
clinically played to forgive someone just because of shared genetics.
You can process complex grief while aggressively maintaining your own emotional boundaries. The wind bites as Serena initiates a verbal ventilation of her repressed hostility. She informs the inert soil that orchestrating his fabricated demise was the ultimate psychological homicide, permanently terminating their baseline trust. She intellectually registers his protective drive, yet his total negation of her personal autonomy inflicts the deepest neurological damage. He's systematically denied her the agency to control her own reality. Demonstrating a physical manifestation of closure, she buries the confession deep in the topsoil, pivoting her body away from the deceased. 6-month shift finds her parking outside a structurally compromised brick facility in a neglected sector. Relocating from your trauma site does not spontaneously delete the neurological scars. It simply indicates a conscious refusal to let the pathology bury you alive. Detective fixture emits a low-frequency hum above the entry, the Lighthouse Foundation. It is a textbook manifestation of post-traumatic sublimation. Chen strategically convinced Serena to repurpose the syndicate illicit capital to engineer a sanctuary for the collateral victims of sociopathic violence. The exact warehouse where she previously experienced massive hemorrhagic shock is now a psychological triage center. Natalia optimized the spatial aesthetics, populating a staff with individuals exhibiting their own severe trauma markers. Serena lacks psychiatric credentials, yet her elevated resilience serves as the biological pacemaker for the operation. It is a profound clinical irony. Frequently, the most debilitating psychological lacerations use precise operational instruments required to extract another individual from cognitive collapse. Natalia breaches the perimeter, carrying 2 coffees. With an unwavering gaze, she is entirely reconstructed from the dissociative juvenile who discharged a firearm into her own father. She processes the agenda before deploying a psychological stressor. Chen is driving to the maximum security facility to observe Luca offering them a seat. Natalia emits a cynical laugh, highlighting the severe cognitive dissonances of intentionally visiting the hostile capture agent who previously held them captive. Serena enters a momentary fugue state, visualizing Luca isolated in a high-security enclosure, absorbing the neurological degradation of incarceration. She regulates her breathing and consents. True clinical forgiveness is a highly complex cognitive protocol. It is never about deleting violent episodic memory, but consciously isolated in the baseline humanity beneath her behavioral pathology. A maximum security penitentiary is an architecture specifically engineered to induce systemic learned helplessness. They enter the sterile visitation sector to locate the subject. Stripped of his lethal autonomy, Luca sits in standard issue institutional garments, yet his ocular tracking remains hypervigilant. He exhibits a brief, startled response upon visually processing Serena. The room saturates with the physiological memory of trauma and blood. Serena inquires about his baseline in prolonged isolation. He deflects with a minimal physical response. Then, he focuses on Natalia, clinically asking how she processes the intrusive ideations of her terminated father. It is an aggressively abrasive inquiry, but you and I understand the mechanics of severe shared trauma. When subjects have endured extreme survival scenarios together, the neurological requirement for polite social masking is permanently deleted. Such a confrontational stimulus would destabilize a normative interaction, but Natalia's nervous system remains regulated. She provides a raw self-assessment. Some nights the survivor's guilt is highly corrosive, while on alternate days it acts as her primary biological motivator. Luca provides affirmative nonverbal feedback, neurologically recognizing that depressive rumination. When Chen mentions their post-traumatic sanctuary, a rare, micro-expression of joy alters Luca's facial geometry. For 1 hour, these damaged clinical profiles simulate normative human bonding. As the institutional signal terminates the session, Serena verbally reinforces his protective behavior during her crisis. Luca rejects this external locus of control, correctly diagnosing that her survival was entirely self-generated. This confirms a vital clinical hypothesis. The most structurally compromised individuals in your orbit often provide the exact schematic required to construct an impenetrable cognitive perimeter. A 24-month latency period stimulates significant neuroplastic recovery. Observe Serena under a high-intensity illumination source at a major criminological symposium. Her heart rate elevates significantly, yet her vocal projection demonstrates absolute locus of control. She dominates the acoustic space, explicitly detailing the fabricated mortality of her primary caregiver and her immersion into the syndicate. This is the ultimate therapeutic breakthrough. She systematically strips the malignant narcissists of their romanticized mythology. Operating as the voice for the collateral damage, the fractured families who realize their primary attachments were highly functional sociopaths. It is a completely unfiltered clinical exposure. You cannot dictate your genetic variables, and you cannot delete the severe neurological damage they encode. But as this case file proves, you exclusively retain the cognitive agency to forge those shattered psychological fragments into heavy ballistic armor. Let us examine this clinical file together, you and I. Serena stands before the crowd, explaining that guilt and innocence are never simple binary states. True rehabilitation is not about conviction, amnesia. It is but deciding who you become after trauma burns your identity to ash. The rumor erupts in heavy applause. Later in the quiet hallway, Merchant approaches with a plain envelope. Inside is a letter from Luke. He walked of the maximum security gates 3 weeks ago. He writes that the state considers him free, but a soldier with his dark conditioning never escapes his ghosts. He is leaving forever. The behavioral takeaway here is necessary. Sometimes the only way to truly reclaim a shattered destiny, as shattered as to pack your bags, abandon the environment that broke you, and disappear to start again. The camera lingers on Serena in the dim apartment. Her fingers trace the ink of Luca's letter. We see shades of Stockholm Syndrome in his admission. He writes to thank her for not hating him when the blood dried. He confesses he finally understands what keeps a man human, watching someone choose mercy when retaliation easy. Serena folds the paper. When Chen asks if she will write back, Serena lets the silence answer. Some ghosts must stay buried. Looking at the dying sun, she realizes the naive doctor she once was is eradicated. We can learn something profound from this behavioral shift. True emotional growth changes you so deeply that your past self becomes a unrecognizable stranger. The death of who you used to be is simply the toll you pay to walk forward. The frame cuts to the harsh glare of a desk lamp. Serena opens a worn notebook, letting the crushing weight of moral injury bleed on the paper. Her pen hesitates. She questions if she even deserves the classification of a good person. To survive the psychological warfare of the syndicate, she made brutal choices a normal mind would reject. Cut to 5 years later. She stands at the Mariners Point Lighthouse. She climbs to the glass deck, the exact room where her father's massive web of narcissistic lies was finally exposed. The freezing wind tears at her coat, offering a grounding clinical truth. No matter how violently your past mistakes claw at your heels, if you force yourself to keep walking through the fire and insist on doing good, you will eventually find your way back to psychological peace. The howling wind breaks as Natalia steps into the frame. The camera catches her steady posture. The traumatized hostage from that dark cabin is gone, replaced by profound psychological growth.
She knew exactly where Serena would be on the anniversary. They leaned against the freezing railing, watching the tourists laugh below. The normal kept them marching,
blind to the blood of their secret war. Natalia turns and asks the heaviest clinical question. If she could rewind the clock, would she undo the damage? Serena lets the agonizing cost of the last 5 years sink in before exhaling a quiet, "No, this lesson here is brutal but strictly necessary." Facing a harsh, bleeding reality will always save your psyche better than hiding comfortably inside a manufactured delusion. Let us look at this behavioral profile together.
You and I, non-suckling.
Standing on that balcony, Serena contemplates the ultimate cognitive dissonance. She analyzes her father, the megalomaniac narcissist who built her moral compass while running a vicious empire. She was fed psychological poison disguised as parental love. Yet, staring at the crashing waves, an exhausted smile breaks across her face. She accepts the ashes of her history, speaking a profound clinical truth to the wind. An ugly reality will always serve mental state better. They warm breeze diption or song. They survive until the sun sinks into the black water, casting the frame in deep blue. Natalia gently bumps Serena's shoulder. It is time to move. Chen is waiting downtown with massive news, and for once, it is positive. The scene cuts to the amber light of a corner restaurant. The camera finds Chen pouring dark red wine in a back booth. Before Serena and Natalia even sit, Chen drops a staggering bombshell. The final guilty verdicts for the syndicate just hit the wire. The sociopathic mob war is officially dead. Then comes the behavioral twist. Chen raises her glass and announces she is turning in her federal badge. She is tired of the violence and wants to join their foundation to rehabilitate broken minds. The psychological lesson here is vital. Sometimes laying down your weapon and walking away from a toxic war is your greatest possible victory. They share a look of earned brotherhood, spending the night laughing like ordinary people who have finally regulated their nervous systems and found peace. The midnight streets swallow the click of their boots. Stepping into the fog, Natalia articulates a clinical truth. They are a functioning family unit now. Serena absorbs the cognitive irony. The individuals who once kidnapped her into the underworld are now her chosen blood. Chen lets out a bitter laugh, diagnosing their existence as unhinged. But think about how human attachment works. Sometimes the exact people who shattered your world are the only ones holding the tools to help you rebuild it. They share an embrace forged in shared trauma. Later, driving home, Serena studies the skyline. This city is a psychological graveyard of megalomaniac mobsters, but healthy people can still breathe. Safe in her apartment, she holds a cup of tea, letting the morning light wash over her healing nervous system. A vibration rattles the table. An unknown number flashes. It is Luca, the enforcer, reaching out to say he is clinically proud of her. Serena stares at the glass, typing and deleting her reply 5 times before sensing a simple acknowledgement. His response is perfectly tragic, a symptom of his conditioned mindset. He says she did the heavy psychological lifting. kept her breathing, becoming her truest protector. It is a vital life lesson to never evaluate the shadows too quickly. Sometimes the worst sociopathic monster in the dark is the one standing guard at your door. Serena smiles, thinking of the data that tore down her father's narcissistic empire. She is no longer an innocent nurse. She is a battle-tested survivor. Her psychological scars are what make her unbreakable today. The foundation doors unlock at 9. Inside, Serena grabs her notebook. Let us examine this closely, because her next entry signals all's total psychological integration. She presses the pen down, owning the clinical truth that she is the offspring of a criminal. She admits to committing violent acts for the right reasons, no longer experiencing cognitive dissonance over being labeled a hero or a villain. She only wants to pull light into the dark. If you take anything away from this file, let it be this. The poisoned history of your family does not have to be your behavioral prisons. You hold the pen, you're on your own ending, staring at the waking city. The camera catches her reflection. She is an ordinary woman dragged into the chaos of the mafia by who clawed her way out of a psychological grave to stand in the sun. As she survived the severe antisocial environments of the underworld, and now she ushers escape. The camera tracks her, blending into the morning rush. And that regulated exterior beats the conditioned heart of a warrior who outlived a mafia war. Returning to the kidnappers who became her securely attached family, she feels a profound psychological peace. It is not some shallow joy, but a blood-earned behavioral acceptance. Listen to me carefully on this clinical point. Scars never mean your psyche is permanently broken. Simply, there is a receipt of your survival, the undeniable proof that your nervous system paid the price and earned your tomorrow. She pushes open the glass doors. Inside, Natalia is waiting, pouring black coffee and laying out the thick case files for the battles ahead. The camera zooms as Natalia looks up from the files. She asks if Serena is mentally prepared for another round. Serena answers without hesitation. She is ready. They step back into the behavioral trenches. They are building clinical lighthouses in antisocial corners of the city, guiding broken psychers back to baseline. Their trauma will never fade, but they have integrated their shadows to become whole. We have analyzed this case file together, you and I. If there is one diagnostic takeaway before we close the folder, it is this. You do not need a spotless psychological past to construct a meaningful future. You just need the courage to keep walking forward. For a crew born in the trauma of mob violence,
Finding regulated peace. It is the chart of cognitive redemption.